Okay, why don't we get started as people trickle in. This is a joint webinar between the Energy Resources and Environment Program and the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Okay, my apologies. It seems like I was still on mute. So this is a joint webinar between the Energy Resources and Environment Program and the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Today it is my great pleasure to welcome Carlos Gould, who is a PhD candidate at Columbia University, and Susmita Patnaik, who is a senior research lead at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in New Delhi, to tell us about the progress and issues and challenges in India's clean cooking fuel revolution. So the way we are going to organize it today is I'm going to ask Carlos and Susmita to give their presentations with some slide share and discussion. And then after that, we are going to open it for a Q&A with the audience. You can use the Q&A function at any time to type in your question, and we will then take those questions as we move forward in the queue. And in the meantime, I'll just remind everybody that if you're interested in following our work, please do check out our website, which is at size-isep.org. So I am typing this in the chat window for everybody's benefit. There you can find information about our research, our upcoming events. There's a blog, there's our media coverage, and lots of other material, including new data on these issues. But with that, I would like to ask Carlos and Susmita to take the lead and share their insights with us. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everybody. And thanks for that introduction, Johannes. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So my name is Carlos Gould. I'm a doctoral candidate at Columbia University. And I'd like to first start off by recognizing and being appreciative of many collaborators and colleagues, both researchers affiliated with ISEP and those at CEW who have really made this work possible. So I'm going to start off today by discussing the framework or the premise for my approach to studying clean cooking, which is primarily driven by the health effects of air pollution. I'm in the School of Public Health, and this is my sort of framework. So air pollution is a major cause of ill health and premature mortality in India. It is estimated that air pollution is responsible for over 1 million premature deaths per year in India alone. And household air pollution, specifically from the combustion of solid fuels and other polluting fuels like firewood, charcoal, dung, and kerosene, is responsible, again, alone for about 500,000 premature deaths per year, primarily from cardiovascular disease and respiratory infections. However, clean cooking fuels promise improved health and well-being for households currently relying on polluting fuels if they are able to fully transition towards a clean fuel. Here, by clean fuel, I refer to something that's clean burning at the point of use, like gas or electricity. However, continued biomass use threatens the benefits of cleaner cooking, since even a little bit of biomass use leads to high air pollution exposure, and therefore a high burden of disease from air pollution. In this light, looking at LPG in India, LPG being the dominant clean cooking fuel in India and also around the world, we can see that via government programs, particularly PMUI, LPG coverage has increased from around 60% to over 90% of households using LPG since just May 2016. But obtaining benefits from these recent gains in LPG use will depend on both the continued use of LPG after adoption and the displacement of biomass in households, which is needed to reduce air pollution exposure and reduce health risk. To address whether there will be benefits from India's efforts to advance clean cooking, we can begin to formulate two research questions. One, how much LPG is consumed by households after they adopt it? And two, how do households use LPG and biomass when they have both in the household? So turning towards the first study that I'll be talking about, we use the Access database, a panel survey administered in 8,500 rural households in 6 North Indian states in 2014, 2015, and 2018, a collaboration between Columbia University, CEW, and the National University of Singapore. We see that LPG ownership increased from 25% to 55%. Half of new LPG owners getting LPG between the two surveys acquired it via PMUI, and 2/3 of LPG owners use it as their main cooking fuel, a promising finding. Nonetheless, over 80% of households are still using biomass to meet some of their cooking needs. So we can say LPG use is up, but biomass persists. But what factors have determined LPG adoption and use? To answer this question, we turn to a two-stage double hurdle model. This is a single model where we are able to assess the determinants of both LPG adoption and subsequent use after adoption together in a single approach. We consider both in the form of LPG use in kilograms per month. However, those that have not adopted LPG consume 0 kilograms per month, as you can see on the far left. This is offset by 1 gram for the purposes of analysis. So in this first stage of the model, we seek to understand the predictors of LPG adoption as a yes or a no. Here we use a parsimonious set of covariates. If a household does adopt LPG, they can be said to have cleared the first hurdle, and they proceed to the second stage, where we model LPG use in kilograms per month. One of the great benefits of the two-stage double hurdle model is that in the second stage, we can include covariates that would otherwise be perfectly correlated with the first stage LPG adoption, like whether the household is a PMUI beneficiary and how many years they've been using LPG. Factors that may be very important in determining how a household uses LPG, but are also by their very nature mean that the household has adopted LPG. So in the interest of time and focusing on LPG use, I'll only briefly mention that education, caste, and wealth were very strongly associated with LPG adoption. That is, households that have better educated, formally educated household heads are more likely to adopt LPG. Households in the general caste more likely to adopt LPG, and households that are wealthier, again, more likely to have adopted LPG. But focusing on one of our main findings, we find that PMUI beneficiaries consume significantly less LPG than general customers after adoption. So again, our outcome is predicted monthly consumption of LPG in kilograms. So we can see here that a household that has acquired LPG through PMUI is predicted to consume around 5.5 kilograms of LPG per month. In comparison, a general customer is predicted to consume just under 8 kilograms per month. All of this controlling for baseline characteristics listed below, the state, and also the number of years a household has been using LPG. These findings translate to about 6.6 large cylinders refills per year for a general customer, and around 4.7 large cylinder refills per year for a PMUI beneficiary. Explaining the difference in consumption between PMUI beneficiaries and general customers remains an elusive question and a billion-dollar question. In this study, we offer a little bit of information as to this gap. We approached trying to understand how PMUI beneficiaries and general customers interacted and perceived LPG and whether there were any differences. But they both were Both groups reported satisfaction with LPG similarly. That is, they were very satisfied with LPG. They both reported similar reasons for being satisfied with LPG, that it's clean cooking, that it's fast, and it's convenient. They also reported similar reasons for not being satisfied with LPG. I'll touch on those later, but namely that it's costly. We do provide some preliminary evidence for LPG cylinder refill access, explaining the difference in consumption. What I refer to here is, again, very preliminary evidence, but that we see that PMUI beneficiaries live in communities and villages where access to LPG cylinder refills is less consistent, or that there's less good access to LPG cylinder refills. That is, there are fewer deliveries to the doorstep. And when a household does have to travel to acquire an LPG cylinder refill, that on average, these villages, somebody has to travel further. So in promoting in promoting LPG to more marginalized communities and marginalized households, PMUI has been successful. However, the LPG cylinder distribution network perhaps maybe has not caught up yet. Regardless, LPG is popular. We asked households if they were satisfied with their cooking arrangement. When gas was the only cooking fuel that a household used, about 90% of households said that they were satisfied. When gas was supported by a polluting fuel like firewood, 81% of households said that they were satisfied. When gas played a supporting role itself to a polluting fuel like firewood, now about 60% of households were satisfied. And when a polluting fuel like firewood was the only cooking fuel, now only 42% of households were satisfied. Some of the reasons for not being satisfied with LPG include, again, poor availability, that is the frequency with which somebody has the opportunity to buy an LPG cylinder refill, that it's far to procure. For many households, they do not, in fact, get their LPG cylinder refills delivered to the doorstep, so they have to travel somewhere. And given that cylinders are heavy, distance is a major constraint. But primarily, gas is expensive to use. LPG cylinder refills, while subsidized, remain costly for poor households. In addition to 95% of households remarking that a reason they were dissatisfied with LPG was its cost, we also asked households that used LPG as a secondary fuel. And again, 95% reported that the primary reason it was their secondary fuel, as opposed to using it more, was that it was because of it's expensive. So we have some takeaways from this initial study. Despite advances in LPG adoption and use, biomass is a persistent cooking fuel for households. PMUI beneficiaries use LPG less than general customers, even after accounting for geography, wealth, socioeconomic status, and years of using LPG. Commonly noted potential factors for explaining the consumption gap. Nonetheless, LPG is very popular, but it's expensive and access to refills remains a challenge, especially for PMUI households, our research begins to suggest. So, given that it is clear that households will use both a clean fuel and a polluting fuel together in most circumstances, how can we conceptualize fuel stacking? How can we move past these top-line findings and government reports indicating that PMUI beneficiaries consume X numbers of cylinders refills per year, indicating that they are also using a biomass fuel? How can we provide more context to findings like that? First, I'm going to discuss some of the motivations for fuel stacking. What I refer to here is that a household uses both a clean cooking fuel and a polluting fuel. Primarily, I argue, household energy security is the main reason for fuel stacking. Here, I'm defining that as the ability to consistently meet all energy needs. So, in order to meet all energy needs consistently for a household with a clean cooking fuel, they would need to be affordable, consistently and easily available, and be able to meet all household energy needs. That is, they'd have to be compatible with cooking styles. They would need to be able to be used to cook all dishes, and they may need to meet non-cooking energy end uses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize measuring fuel stacking in a relatively short survey. And then my colleague, Sasmita, is going to talk a little bit about an effort that we've done and present some initial results on fuel stacking. So I'm going to specify 4 central questions. We can ask which fuels are used and how frequently are they used? Which dishes are cooked with each fuel? Does the household have energy needs other than cooking? And do these energy demands or fuel use patterns vary over the year, perhaps due to seasonal weather patterns, climate, or wage or income fluctuations? So to address this first question, we can ask a series of 2 simple questions. For example, in the last 4 days, can you tell me the fuel or energy source that you have used most of the time for cooking food, making tea or coffee, and boiling drinking water? And then to ascertain which is the dominant cooking fuel, we can ask directly, can you tell me, this would tell us the dominant cooking fuel. And then wanting to know which other fuels are used, we can ask them to name all of the fuels or energy sources that have been used. Turning to frequency, rather than just a relative frequency, for example, we can ask, how often did you use your LPG stove for cooking in the last week? With the below options. With LPG and other fuels, we can also ask this question a couple different ways. We can ask, how many large LPG cylinder refills did you acquire in the last year? Here we get a sort of objective measure of overall consumption as ascertained by this important monetary investment. But if a household has only recently acquired LPG, this may not reflect true use. So we can take a second approach. We can ask a series of 2 questions. When was the last time you acquired a large LPG cylinder refill? And when will you next acquire a large LPG cylinder refill? Turning to then which dishes are cooked with each fuel, we can ask, which of the following items do you cook with LPG regularly? Asking directly an important dish with options yes, no, or I don't cook this dish. We can turn to another important dish and repeat for all dishes and fuels. But perhaps we want to compare in a shorter period of time which dishes are cooked. So we can ask a shorter time frame. In the past week, did you cook vegetables, for example? If yes, then we can ask somebody to name all of the fuels and energy sources used to cook vegetables. Here we begin to get a richer understanding of how households meet their daily cooking needs. But sometimes there are non-cooking energy demands. We can ask, for example, do you ever burn solid fuels for any of the following non-cooking tasks in the home? Perhaps space heating when it's cold, preparing fodder for animals, or heating water for bathing? If yes, we might want to know the intensity with which somebody carries out this activity. So we can ask a series of targeted questions about how many months during the year the activity is undertaken. In those months of the year, how many days in the month? In those days, how many hours? And then it's important to know whether the cooking activity is being done inside, outside, or sometimes both, as we begin to piece together an image of potential health risk from these additional activities. An important, but as yet somewhat not well understood phenomenon is the seasonality of these cooking patterns. Not well understood because it's very intensive to acquire information over the course of an entire year. Nonetheless, we might just simply ask during the winter, which is your main cooking fuel, and then during the rainy season, which is your main cooking fuel. One could get more specific repeating all of the other questions, or try to undertake a repeated measure survey during among the same households during multiple times of year. In short, with relatively simple questions, we can assess specific patterns of fuel use to understand the extent to which households use both clean and polluting fuels. Here, we've got two takeaways from this presentation. First, LPG has expanded across rural India, but progress remains uneven, and PMUI beneficiaries use LPG significantly less than general customers. And our second takeaway, understanding precise fuel stacking patterns can provide insights into specific factors that contribute to continued biomass use and, subsequently, air pollution exposure. I'd like to acknowledge the multiple collaborators and funding sources that have supported these research endeavors. In the joint modeling paper has been published in Environmental Research Communications and is freely available. And I'd like to thank collaborator Shausha Hao, Anjali Sharma, Jen Richmond, and Johannes. The access survey and ongoing research is only made possible through collaborations with the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. And my contact information is here. Now I'd like to turn it over to Sasmita, who's going to talk a little bit more about our work related to understanding fuel stacking. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlos. Sasmita, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend this webinar today. And thank you for the opportunity to speak here. So I'm going to talk about a study that we are in the process of analyzing, and this was a survey we did in collaboration with ISEP in early 2020. The study focuses on clean cooking energy access in urban slums. We thought this was an important segment to focus on because in a lot of conversation around energy access, the rural poor is often the focus of these conversations, even with major schemes that come in. But a segment that is often missed out on is the urban slums. Just to kind of give you a context about CW, if you don't know about the organization, we are a policy research institution that works across a range of issues in sustainable development. And we use data and evidence to be able to understand the issues which are policy relevant across sectors. So this survey covered both rural households as well as urban slums in 6 of the Indian states. These were primarily Hindi-speaking states in central in the central part of the country. These states basically have the lowest socio-economic demographic index, as well as one of the highest levels of disease burden due to air pollution. These states are also have one of the largest share of households that have been covered under the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana. This survey was conducted with the primary cook of the households. About the socio-economic characteristics of the households that were surveyed, now 82% of these households were from notified slums. Notified slums are basically slums that are recognized by the government. So because of recognition, a lot of infrastructural access gets better, at least on paper, for these slums. 30% of them did not have even a single pakka room, despite being in urban areas. 44% of these households do not have a separate kitchen. And these were all slums in non-metro cities of the country. So the slums in metro cities would rather behave a little differently because of the fact that they're based out of metro cities. And a lot of research have been done on slums which are in the metros, but these were not based in the metros. Just wanted to clarify that. Majority of the population in these slums were from the marginalized communities of scheduled caste and other backward castes. general population formed a very minor share of the population. And over half of them have casual labor as their primary income. And more than 60% had a median monthly income of less than 10,000 rupees. So despite the relatively presumed better levels of income in urban slums, we saw that about 1/3 of the households in these slums were stacking LPG with a polluting fuel, and about 12% of them were only using polluting fuels. And when we looked at the proportion of households who were stacking, of course, a majority of them, like 88% of them, were using LPG as a primary fuel and then stacking with firewood, animal waste, charcoal, and kerosene as secondary. The research shows that households with obviously higher asset ownership have better odds of using LPG as an exclusive fuel, something that Carlos also pointed out to. However, what we see is it doesn't necessarily mean that if you are a wealthy household, you use LPG as an exclusive fuel either, because we saw that households who are in the upper quintiles, upper asset quintiles were also stacking, but for not affordability reasons, reasons other than households, again, which had better home delivery were more likely to use LPG as an exclusive fuel. And the ones who did not receive home delivery of LPG cylinders, about 46% of them reported having to forego their daily wages to procure the cylinder. 1/5 of the households using LPG exclusively were PMUI households, which is interesting because that means that there are a proportion of PMUI households who have been able to move to exclusive use of the fuel in a short span of time. What we see is these households definitely have a relatively better economic status than the households who are stacking. So the graph on the left, what I'd like to show here is in the asset quintiles 2 and 3, you see the proportion of stacking increases. Because as households are using LPG, they're also using polluting fuel simultaneously. And then it gradually reduces when we go towards the upper quintile. So, but if you look at the lowest asset quintile, the proportion of households using only polluting fuel is about 1/4, right? Like a higher proportion of households are not even able to stack. So stacking is not necessarily a bad thing, which if the households are in the intermediate phases of stacking, that means they are using both fuels simultaneously. So there is a bit of clean cooking fuel involved. And then gradually they move to greater use of cooking fuels. And that's the direction we want to nudge and move towards, nudge the households and move towards. Now 45% of the households were using multiple stoves at the same time while preparing a single meal. So they would be using, say, LPG for cooking a certain dish and then firewood for another. About 30% of households are using using polluting fuels for heating water for bathing, and 10% of them are using these fuels for space heating. We also see a difference when it comes to seasons, something that Carlos also pointed out. In summers and rainy season, you would see the use of LPG going higher. Again, during festivals, there's a higher preference for use of LPG. In winters, the proportion of households using LPG as the primary fuel falls. And there needs to be more research done to understand this better, but our hypothesis is it could also be because they're using firewood for space heating, which makes it more easy for them to use it for cooking as well. Speaking about air pollution, of course, one of the most dominant issues that we are facing, especially when it comes to indoor air pollution. Over 3/4 of the households in our survey were using polluting fuels inside the main house. They were cooking inside the main house. And only 1/3 of the households using such fuels had a chimney for ventilation. Non-cooking uses like space heating also exposes these households to the emissions from burning of used fuels. And like we saw in the previous slide, in the winter months, the use of firewood increases, the use of polluting fuels increase. But these are also the months where the PM 2.5 concentrations are the highest. So there's a double burden of pollution that these households are facing because of the season as well as the increased use of polluting fuels. This is something that is something we need to be cognizant of when we are designing policies or interventions for addressing this issue. Yeah, so I'll just stop here. Thank you so much, and happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Sasmita, for sharing those really interesting insights. It's quite a rich data set, and I think it will provide many interesting insights into these issues. So what I'm going to do is I first want to ask each of you one question, and then after that we'll start going through the Q&A. We do have some questions popping up there. So my first question is for Carlos. So Carlos, you have done research not only in India, but also in other places. You've looked at Ghana, I know you've looked at Ecuador as well. How does the Indian kind of fuel stacking situation and government policy, how does it compare to these other countries? Is India unique, or is this a kind of a well-trodden path? What is your thinking on this comparison?
Yeah, that's a very good question. India is very unique because of the scale of the issues. So the burden of disease is incredibly large because there are so many households, there's so much consumption, and the investment by the government of India and oil marketing companies is unparalleled in terms of size and scope. India's ongoing transition to clean cooking may very well be the largest and the quickest transition in the world. So on that level, it is very unique. With that said, the questions of fuel stacking are true everywhere in the world, regardless at this point of sort of any context. I know here in my own home, I've got several different types of ways to cook things or heat things, and I'm sure we all do. So that is going to be persistent. And what we're aiming to achieve are minimally polluting fuel stacking, minimally polluting fuel stacks, not necessarily some perfect ideal of fuel stacking. So I think size, scope, and speed set India apart, but issues related to fuel stacking are universal.
By the way, that's a great paper title: Size, Scope, and Speed, the Indian clean energy transition. Wonderful. Thank you, Carlos. That's really interesting insight. Sasmita, I'm interested in your thoughts on the reasons why fuel stacking continues in India. So we heard from Carlos some very interesting hypotheses, energy security, affordability, and so on. Do you have some kind of succinct way of summarizing why fuel stacking remains so prevalent in India?
Sorry. Of course, affordability comes up as the most obvious reason, but I think that's one of the reasons, of course. But there are other reasons like availability of the fuel easily throughout the year at your doorstep, and affordability also not just about the amount that you pay together, but also of the cash flow of the household. So if the household is earning through casual labor and they're making smaller amounts of income throughout the month, then they can't pay together an upfront cost of a refill. So of course, affordability needs to be looked at as both absolute as well as that cash flow aspect of the problem. But I think culturally also, if you think about it, a lot of households in India have now started accepting the idea that you need to pay for a cooking fuel. It was always supposedly free. Now a lot of households are paying even for firewood because the availability is a challenge. And here I also feel the the fact that cooking is a gendered problem, the fact that it is something that is always looked at as a woman's domain, therefore has other intra-household agency related issues, which prevent it from taking the kind of scale or importance within the household that, say, for example, an investment in a productive asset would, such as electricity or other equipment. I think these are some of the reasons which, in addition to affordability, could be.
Perfect. That's really interesting, and it kind of reminds me some of the same challenges in the electricity sector. So this idea that you need to pay for electricity, some kind of a price, it varies by context and over time. And so it's interesting to think that in the clean cooking fuel case, also this idea of paying for your cooking fuel is evolving. That's not something that I had thought of. So thanks for bringing up that. That's a really interesting insight. Let's take some questions from the Q&A. So I have here a question from Tabare Paliano, who's asking about methanol stoves. So the question is, did the work of reference consider or compare a methanol stove cooking as part of the LPG study? And so the idea here would be that methanol has some benefits, reducing greenhouse gases, because it's not a fossil fuel the same way that LPG is. So I guess this is probably for Carlos, I think, but I will also hear Susmita's thoughts on this one.
Sure. So ethanol was not commonly found in the study sample. So we really directly examined responses from rural households. And because methanol doesn't have a large presence at this moment in the regions that we were studying, we don't consider it directly. But the point is well taken. In some parts of the world, ethanol may be very well an important clean cooking fuel because it does burn cleanly. And there is some initial evidence that transitions to ethanol will provide health benefits. Certainly theoretically, it should. And the question, it rightly points out that ethanol could also be an important carbon mitigation strategy.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlos. And so, Susmita, maybe could you tell us a little bit about the cooking mix cooking fuel mix in India today, so the audience can understand what are the different options that people use and how important they are?
Yeah, so primarily it would be firewood and agri residue as well. Again, animal waste, dung cakes basically are very prominent in certain states more than the other. And now with the new scheme, Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, you have almost all the households in the country having an LPG connection. How much they use it is like secondary, but everybody would have an LPG connection. And even before the scheme, a lot of households did have LPG and they would use it for special occasions like a festival or making specific items, which is something we saw in Access 2015 as well, data as well, like they're using it to make tea and snacks. Or if they have to quickly rush for something because it's convenient, it's easy to make. But because it's also so convenient, it's guarded, it's precious, it's expensive. So you're also being cautious about using it. So now that is something that's trying to that the government is trying to change. Electricity for cooking is also something that's being talked about. However, there are a lot of challenges with respect to the stability of the grid and the kind of reliability of the electricity that can be provided. So alternatively, there are companies who are looking at solar powered cooking solutions, which are battery operated, could have a storage option. So these are just up and coming solutions. We don't know when it will be economically viable for households to start using them. But firewood is going to play an important role in the cooking mix for some time to come. Also because there are other uses of it, like space heating and water preparation and water boiling and stuff.
Excellent, thank you, Susmita. That's very helpful. And next, I have a question from Darpan Das, who is asking about the PMUY scheme to promote LPG. So the question is, is there a way that an intermediary clean fuel could be a solution? Could there be some kind of a processed fuel that could be easier to deploy and that could be made locally to kind of facilitate the transition toward LPG? So maybe Sasmita, you can take the first stab at this question.
Intermediary solutions are present and are being tried by not necessarily the government, but the private sector, where you have pelletization of firewood, improved cook stoves. Biogas plants is something that the government has invested in, but it's not somehow worked out, at least in India. So there are intermediate solutions. I think what can be done is to something that Carlos also pointed out before is to kind of look at a clean stack and market a clean stack as an idea and not one fuel. And if households were given the kind of support to invest in any kind of clean cooking fuel as opposed to just one fuel, that could be an intermediary solution. However, we also have to look at aspirations and interests and willingness of the household as well. A lot of households in India want to use LPG. It's aspirational, it's convenient, they have always wanted to use it. So the obvious desire is to use that. So how do you find that balance is also going to be important. Electricity is something that can definitely work, but I mean, maybe for specific meals or items that can be focused on.
Perfect, thank you. So Carlos, I want to follow up on this question from Darpan. One fuel that in some parts of India is used quite commonly is coal. So for example, in the state of Jharkhand, where we are doing some work, people use a lot of coal. So is coal like clean cooking fuel? How does it compare to firewood, LPG, electricity, and so on?
From the perspective of public health, coal is not a clean cooking fuel. When it burns, it produces a lot of byproducts of incomplete combustion, many of which are extremely health damaging. So it brings with it a significant amount of health risk. So from a health perspective, it cannot be considered clean at all. With respect to the intermediate clean fuel option, I think Sasmita has hit on some very important points related to identifying clean stacks, which may very well be locally relevant. So maybe in some parts of India, biogas is a useful step. In other parts, perhaps ethanol or some other type of fuel. Processed biomass, I would say, is tricky because in some places it burns relatively cleanly, but there isn't very much long-term evidence for processed biomass to reduce air pollution exposure to very low levels in the long term. One benefit of LPG is that because there's such a massive demand and infrastructure for LPG in India, there comes with it this certain amount of stability moving forward, both for the fuel, but also for simple things like repair and maintenance services. So if somebody's regulator breaks, one can be easily procured. But if one of 15,000 processed biomass stoves breaks, such a maintenance pathway may not be so easily available. So I think that that's an important consideration when considering sort of intermediate steps.
So this is actually a really interesting point. So in some sense, it's good that there are different options available and you can kind of tailor your solutions to local context, but there's also benefits to economies of scale. If you have this huge LPG infrastructure, then you have available all these services and infrastructure and deliveries, everything in a way that you would not if every place had a slightly different way of doing clean cooking. So that's very interesting. Sasmita, just a quick follow-up for you. Is there any progress on biogas in India? Because I know that in some parts of India, for example, the state of Odisha, there's been a lot of interest in this solution. So has there been any progress in making this kind of expanded work?
Not from the government side of things. There's increasing interest in looking at, say, biogas as a service as opposed to households themselves owning biogas plant. I know of organizations who are trying to look at can biogas be packaged and delivered to households like LPG cylinders. Now that could be an innovation that definitely works for households if it's closer, easily available. From the government side of things, biogas has taken a very different kind of direction. It's being looked at as bio-CNG options or other kinds of procurement which can be commercially more viable. It has not so much come back to focus within the household domain because LPG has kind of taken over a lot of this discussion. In this, I would like to just bring in a point, which is something we worked on last year, which is around a concept called energy safety nets, where you're trying to look at a basic level of energy access as a bare minimum, and then figure out interventions outside the scope of energy domain to make it viable for households to access. For example, now access to cooking energy is also a health issue, right? So why can't we look at pool of money within Ministry of Health or climate change? Or even livelihood interventions, because it also has an economic benefit for women of the household to be able to use that time in other activities or reduce drudgery. So can some of these policies and schemes be linked, or these interventions be linked to sectors outside of the energy space, and therefore create more opportunities for households to be able to pay for these solutions? Or get access to these solutions through existing government support programs. Now that could be something to think about. I'm not sure if we have enough to just get started with, but something we can start thinking about and move towards that direction.
Excellent, thank you. That's actually really interesting. And the work that you did on these energy safety nets, this was with the Sustainable Energy for All coalition. Okay, so I would encourage everybody to check out. If you happen to have a link, feel free to put it in the chat window for the benefits of the audience, so they can learn more about that work as well. Okay, and I do see that so Darpan, who asked about the question about intermediary fuels, notes that they've actually done some work on this. So in the Q&A answer section, there is a link to a study on quantifying the emissions from coal cook stoves in India, which I think is fascinating, and I look forward to reading it after this webinar. So thank you for sharing that link. We have another question from John Michael Murray, who's asking about CNG and LPG in India. So is CNG a cost competitive alternative for this kind of cooking? Maybe Sasmita, you are probably the best person to comment on this.
Not so far. I mean, it's something that the oil marketing companies are trying to work with, but I think there's a lot to be done around sourcing, supply chain. The stability of the LPG infrastructure to be replicated would take time, especially for the CNG market. So I don't, based on whatever interactions and data that we've looked at, it's not something that's been considered for the cooking space.
Got it. Yeah, so we've seen mostly CNG in things like transportation more than in the cooking. Exactly.
Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
Got it. So that seems to be a solution that at this point is still is not yet ready for scaling. Yeah. So with that, I have one more question. I think we don't have any other questions from the audience right now. So I have one more question for Carlos. I want to go back to your framing of this issue as a kind of energy security issue. So if that is correct, if there's a kind of a household energy security issue, would that have any implications for how to reduce fuel stacking and move toward I shouldn't say fuel stacking, but move toward the clean stack? Is there some kind of key implication from that framework that we should consider?
It means that it's going to be hard. from my perspective. As you mentioned earlier, I have some work in Ecuador where the government has subsidized LPG to only be 10% of the market price. So for a 15 kilogram cylinder, customers are paying $2.50. That is, it's extremely cheap. So, but nonetheless, there remains some persistent firewood use because in some regions, households may only have access to an LPG cylinder refill once a week. And now once a week, from the context of many rural communities elsewhere around the world, is fairly frequent. But even that sort of gap, or the fear that there might be a gap in access, leads people to retain their firewood. And as long as they conceptualize firewood as an option that they use, they'll continue to use it, or the sort of non-cooking tasks. So, you know, it means that it's going to be a very challenging issue. And the more that I do this work, the more that I become thankful for extremely stable electricity and piped gas.
Okay. So that is very insightful. Thanks for sharing that. It's a really interesting frame. We do have one more specific question here. So this is again from John Michael Murray, who's asking about energy security at the higher level. So where does India get most of its LPG? So Susmita, do you have any insight into this?
Yeah, India gets most of its LPG from the Middle East, like Saudi, Kuwait, Qatar, and actually we import crude oil and process it within the country. So there's a lot of processing plants as well within the country. Yeah, so completely reliant on imports, and that's been one of the concerns that a lot of people have pointed out. And therefore, the government is trying very hard to rationalize and target subsidies around LPG. However, we are also at a point where most of our population doesn't have access to clean cooking energy. And this seems to be the easiest way to provide that. So to be able to balance both these problems at the same time, there is heavy reliance on imports. And India therefore does benefit from reduction in oil prices globally. Whenever that happens, but yeah, so that's something that is.
So let me follow up on that, because you bring up a very interesting point here. Do you have a sense of how much of India's overall crude oil imports or consumption goes into LPG? Any percentage?
Not sure about that, but I know about 80% of our crude oil is kind of imported.
Yeah, so India is very heavily dependent on imports. I'm just again wondering, like, is this a kind of a priority energy security issue, or should we be much more worried about getting the electric vehicles on the road while solving the household cooking fuel and not worrying too much about it? This is something I'm going to check after this webinar, because I think it's actually a very important point. I've heard people bring this up many times, that we should not use LPG for household cooking. But given the staggering numbers of kind of illness and death from this, it seems like there is a very difficult trade-off here, and might be that we should keep doing this regardless, and instead put the money into electric vehicles though.
And if you think about it, for years we use petrol and diesel and all these fuels to power our economy, right? When it comes to the health of the cook of the household, I think there's suddenly a lot more concern around imports, which is legitimate. But also a little biased that we used the other fuels for this long to build the economy. So yes, the alternatives might be to move to, say, piped natural gas in urban areas, or electric cooking in urban areas, and reduce the LPG, or just limit it to rural areas where it's difficult to provide piped natural gas infrastructure, and gradually phase it out. And then, like you said, move other sectors to cleaner energy solutions faster, like transport.
Good. All right. So there's a great roadmap for government of India. That's an excellent summary. Thank you, Susmita. So with that, we are approaching the end of our time. I'd like to again thank Carlos and Susmita for taking the time. Carlos very early in the morning, Susmita in the evening. So thank you for accommodating us in a world of time zones. Thanks to everybody in the audience for joining us. I think this has been a remarkably insightful and interesting discussion. And so again, I do remind everybody, do follow up on our work at size-isep.org. You can learn more about CEW's excellent work in India at cew.in. So that's a website full of information. And Carlos also shared in his presentation his contact information and the reference. We will be sharing the recording and materials for this meeting afterwards. You will get them on email. So thank you again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Bye.